For a genre of music that gets labeled as immature, overly sensitive high school music, I think sometimes people forget just how popular pop punk was at the height of its mainstream success. Today I'm going to do a complete overview of pop punk. I'll talk about who started pop punk, the mainstream success and decline, the 2010s revival, and what's happening in the scene right now. First, let's start at the beginning. Let's find out what pop punk actually is and who was the first pop punk band. So what is pop punk? Pop punk is basically catchy rock and roll, with lyrics that focus on adolescence. To understand pop punk, you first have to understand punk rock. What does punk rock sound like? Think of Black Flag, The Bad Brains, Minor Threat. What do those bands sound like? Gritty, raw, fast, angry. It's not immediately catchy, it's not easy to digest. Pop punk is easy to digest. It's immediately catchy. It keeps the energy and speed of punk rock, but makes it poppy. Pop punk is a bright, sunny day. It's something you can sing along to. That's pop punk. What do people think of when they think of pop punk? Songs about love, breakups, hating your hometown? There is so much more to pop punk. Side note, there's always been this kind of joke about pop punk that it's just love songs and breakup songs, but 95% of music, or probably even more, is about love. Most human-created art is about love. Music, movies, paintings, poetry, books. They're mostly about love. So why is pop punk the only genre of music that gets made fun of? Because most of its lyrics and songs are about love. Most songs are about love. So who is the first pop punk band? We really have two choices, the Buzzcocks and the Ramones. Both bands were releasing music in the late 70s and 80s. The Ramones play fast, catchy rock and roll, and the Buzzcocks play fast, catchy rock and roll. So the reason I think the Ramones usually get the distinction of being the first pop punk band is because the Ramones and their songs were just catchier, faster, and they were more gritty than the Buzzcocks. In my opinion, the first pop punk band, it has to be the Ramones, not just for what they did to pop punk, but really to their contribution to rock and roll and punk rock history in mainstream pop culture. I mean, if you went and asked a casual music fan to name a punk rock band, one of the bands they'd probably say is the Ramones. And we have this clip from the Punk's Not Dead documentary.
We were a fast pop punk, very in-your-face band.
Yeah. That's pretty much case closed. And an album that doesn't get enough recognition, especially in those early primordial years of pop punk, was the Descendants' Milo Goes to College. That album was released in 1982. I remember when I was first getting into punk rock, and obviously, Milo Goes to College is one of those albums that are always on a list of, pop punk or punk rock albums that you have to listen to. And I remember listening to it and being blown away when I realized that it came out in 1982. To me, it doesn't sound like it was released in 1982. And even more than the Ramones, if you look up lists about the best pop punk albums of all time, Milo Goes to College is on way more than any of the Ramones albums. And I know some people are watching this saying, Michael, what are you talking about? Everybody knows about Milo Goes to College. But I'm talking about more in a mainstream sense, to like a casual fan. If you went on the street and talked to a casual fan of pop punk music and told them how great Milo Goes to College is and how it's one of the best pop punk albums of all time, they'd probably look at you, call you a poser, tell you to go home and educate yourself by listening to real pop punk like Yellowcard. Quick sidebar, I always love when real punks, the gatekeepers, they hate on pop punk because, they don't like songs about love or, hating your hometown and all that kind of stuff. But they can't hate Milo Goes to College because most people consider that if not a pop punk album, a punk rock album, and everybody respects the Descendants, and everybody agrees Milo Goes to College is such a great album. So those gatekeepers, those angry punk rockers, they have to like at least one pop punk album in Milo Goes to College. I always envision like from like a movie, a robot that's getting, mixed signals and doesn't know what to do and it explodes. I like to think of punk rock gatekeepers in my mind like that. In 1991, we got Nevermind by Nirvana, which of course changed rock music forever. The success of Nevermind told record labels two things: rock music could be popular, and rock music can make you money. This led to the quick success of labels like Fat Wreck, Lookout, and Epitaph Records. Bands like NoFX, Offspring, Rancid, Pennywise, Green Day, Lagwagon, No Use for a Name, Propaganda all exploded in popularity. The most important band for our discussion is Green Day. Dookie was released in 1994, and pop punk was never the same. Dookie is considered one of the best pop punk and punk rock albums of all time. It mixed catchy, punky songs with lyrics about growing up, love, feeling like a loser, and just trying to find your place in the world. All these years later, and Dookie is still the standard for pop punk. It's the best pop punk album of all time. But it doesn't have the best pop punk song of all time. But we'll get to that later. During the same time that all these bands were getting popular, we had the creation of the Vans Warped Tour. You can't really talk about the history of emo, pop punk, and punk rock without mentioning the Warped Tour. The Warped Tour was founded by Kevin Lyman, and it capitalized on the skyrocketing popularity of punk rock and pop punk at the time. The festival was a one-day traveling circus/festival for people to go to in the summer, and you got to see so many bands within the scene that you may not have otherwise seen if there was no Vans Warped Tour and all the bands were kind of just doing their own individual tours. They may not have gotten to your town, so it really was a quick success in the punk rock scene. Originally, a lot of the bands on the Vans Warped Tour were that 90s skate punk, think, NoFX, that Fat Wreck Chords kind of a sound, but throughout the years, there were so many different genres of music on the Vans Warped Tour that calling it just a punk rock festival wouldn't really be completely accurate. In addition to the Warped Tour, you also had MTV and rock radio, which were still mainstream outlets for pop punk. In the late 90s, we got two important albums from one very important band, Blink-182. Well, I guess this is growing up. I think this is the slogan for pop punk. It encapsulates the ethos of pop punk in one line. It's why I think Damn It is the best pop punk song of all time. The song talks about growing up, being in love, feeling like a failure, being on your own. It has every pop punk cliche before they became cliches. Enema of the State was released in 1999, and really after Dookie, this is the next major pop punk album. Blink took everything that worked on Dude Ranch and turned it up to 11. What's My Age Again, Adam's Song, Anthem, and of course All the Small Things are still, 25 years later, some of the most popular pop punk songs of all time, and some of the most popular pop punk songs today. Blink-182 also used their humor to stand out in the crowded scene, because while some bands didn't want to be perceived as selling out or wanted to keep some mythical real punk rock cred, Blink-182 poked fun at their boy band marketing, creating some of the most iconic music videos of all time. They created all the pop punk stereotypes before they became things synonymous with the scene. Dookie definitely set the foundation of pop punk, but the reason pop punk became mainstream was Enema of the State and Blink-182. The 80s set the foundation. The 90s proved that rock music could be mainstream, but I don't think anybody could imagine just how mainstream and how popular pop punk would become in the 2000s. The 2000s were the height of pop punk's popularity in mainstream pop culture, but it wasn't just pop punk. Emo and punk rock have never been as popular or profitable as they were in the early 2000s. In addition to the business side of pop punk, where record labels were signing every pop punk band that they could, remember, we're still in the early 2000s, so we are at the height of CD sales. Remember, CDs back then were priced anywhere from $10 to $24. People complain now that everything is content, whether it's, stuff on Netflix or all this music coming out on, Apple Music or Spotify, but that has always been the business model. Find something that's a success and then put out as much of that product as possible, and then the bubble bursts. Okay, we've talked a lot about business, so now let's get back to the music. None of this profitable business would have happened if there also wasn't good music coming out. And when you step back and look at all the unbelievable amount of good music that we got during this time, some of the most popular and fan favorite pop punk albums of all time came out in this short window of time. When you look at it all on one screen, it's amazing that all of this great music was released in such a short time. Everything that you're seeing now, all of these albums are all from 2000 to 2006, because, I had to stop somewhere. But just look at this, almost every major pop-punk band is here. New Found Glory, Fall Out Boy, Blink-182, Simple Plan, Good Charlotte, My Chemical Romance, Taking Back Sunday, Paramore, Sum 41, and so many more. And not to mention that a lot of these bands released multiple albums during this time. Even in this short amount of time, you had pop-punk being played differently by each of these bands. You had like Simple Plan and Good Charlotte, who were playing that simple bubblegum boy band pop punk type of sound. You had a band like Sum 41 that was adding metal into their pop punk. You had a band like Taking Back Sunday and Jimmy Eat World who infused emo into their version of pop punk. Something Corporate used the piano, Offspring kept that traditional punk rock sound, Say Anything used theatrics, and you had bands like Green Day and My Chemical Romance that used concept albums or rock operas, whatever you want to call them. With the mainstream success of pop-punk, all those adjacent genres also saw success. Emo, punk rock, and pop-punk are so entrenched and associated with each other, especially in pop culture, that most people think all of those genres are the same thing anyway. And don't forget, you still had MTV, rock radio, and the Vans Warped Tour, all of these mainstream outlets for pop-punk. Speaking of the Warped Tour, I found it really interesting that despite the mainstream success of emo, pop-punk, and punk rock during this time, the only profitable year of the Warped Tour was 2005. During the late 2000s, meaning 2006 to about 2010, we saw the rise of neon pop-punk, which is pop-punk that's even more poppier and had a little bit of electronic sounds mixed in to the traditional pop-punk sound. Bands like Metro Station, Boys Like Girls, Forever the Sickest Kids, All Time Low, The Maine, The Friday Night Boys, and Every Avenue. Pop-punk was at its absolute peak in the early 2000s, but as we got closer to 2010, pop-punk faded away from the mainstream, and the reason why is very clear. After the peak of pop-punk in the 2000s, pop-punk faded away from the mainstream. But why? The answer is actually pretty simple. The popular pop-punk bands either broke up or stopped making pop-punk music. Blink-182 broke up, both Simple Plan and Good Charlotte tried to make a mature album, and Good Charlotte actually kinda pulled it off. My Chemical Romance made a straight-up pop-punk album in Danger Days, but fans hated it. Fall Out Boy made a rock album, and fans hated it, even though Water Buffaloes is like a top 5 Fall Out Boy song. Pinpointing the exact moment rock music stopped being mainstream is hard, but I'm gonna go with My Chemical Romance's The Black Parade in 2006.
You what?
I'm not saying there was no great emo or pop-punk between 2006 and 2010, but when people reminisce about 2000s emo and pop-punk, it seems like the last major release they talk about is The Black Parade, and then after that, the bubble burst. Between 2006 and 2010, a few emo bands and pop-punk bands did remain in the mainstream, Paramore probably being the most notable example. Riot is, of course, a pop-punk classic, and I already talked about Fall Out Boy. You also had Panic at the Disco, they were still around, but the party was really over. All of those mainstream outlets that promoted pop-punk just stopped. MTV switched to reality TV, rock radio just never adapted and evolved, and dance pop and hip-hop replaced rock as the dominant mainstream genre of music. The last gasp of a true underground pop-punk adjacent genre was easycore, which started in 2006 with New Found Glory, and then kept going with bands like Set Your Goals, 4 Years Strong, A Day to Remember, and later with Chunk, No Captain Chunk. But easycore wasn't mainstream at all, and all of those bands really saw more success in the 2010s. While pop-punk in the mainstream declined, there was a revival right around the corner. After pop-punk faded away from the mainstream, it went back to the underground, and we got the 2010s pop-punk revival, where we defended pop-punk, we ate pizza, we hung out with our friends, and we hated our hometown. I was in high school and college during the 2010s, so I was there while this revival was happening. I listened to all the music, I went to all the shows. This is the era of pop-punk that I'm nostalgic for because it was my youth. The band that started the 2010s pop-punk revival was the Wonder Years and their album, The Upsides. The lyrics, "I'm not sad anymore, I'm just tired of this place," became a rallying cry for fans of pop-punk during the 2010s. The Wonder Years were young, angry, fun, and they really revolutionized pop-punk storytelling in the 2010s. If Nevermind by Nirvana killed all the hair metal bands, then the Wonder Years killed all the pop-punk boy bands of the 2000s. Think of the sound of 2000s pop-punk, because this is what pop-punk sounded like in the 2010s.
I'm just so tired. I spent this year as a ghost, and I'm not sure what I'm looking for. All that I know is your space is empty, it's buried below.
A band like The Story So Far mixed hardcore with pop-punk. Man Overboard kept that Blink-182 style of pop-punk. State Champs had that mainstream upbeat sound, Neck Deep was fast and intense, and a band like Modern Baseball mixed pop-punk with indie and emo, and was the first band to start using social media in their lyrics. A band that mastered the Ramones core style of pop-punk during the 2010s was Masked Intruder. Their 2012 self-titled album is a great pop-punk album. I know the gimmick of the band might turn some people away, but their 2012 album is the best Ramones album since the Ramones. In the 2000s, a lot of the pop-punk bands were marketed as boy bands. Boy bands writing simple, upbeat songs for teenagers. The 2010s was different. The music was more mature. It was a little bit more heavier than what came before. Sure, of course, there was a lot of cringy stuff in the 2010s, just like there was in the early 2000s, but the bands that we still talk about, the music that we still listen to, a lot of that stuff was not boxed in like the pop-punk bands were in the early 2000s. The 2010s was also a emo revival as well as a pop-punk revival. It was really a revival of everything under the alternative rock genre banner: punk rock, emo, pop-punk, hardcore, metal, ska. All of those genres had their moment in the 2010s just because all those genres are so closely attached together. All the bands toured together, all of the fans online compared all these bands together, so naturally, everyone was kind of risen up and taken to that next level of popularity. The 2010s was also defined by the rise of social media. All of a sudden, bands could share their music with the click of a button. It was easier to discover new music, and for bands, it was easier to share new music. And throughout the video, I've talked about mainstream outlets for pop-punk, and in the 2010s, we saw a massive shift in what was an outlet for pop-punk specifically. You had blogs, you had YouTubers, you had independent interviews. All of this became the go-to outlet for bands in the pop-punk scene because there was no more music on MTV. Rock radio was run by idiots, and the Warped Tour ended in 2019. So you really had to look at all of these new and kind of different opportunities to talk about your music and get your music out there. Social media made this worldwide revival seem so small. It connected people from around the world. It bridged the geographical gap between fans, and you got to experience this worldwide revival in your room, on your phone, or on your computer. Social media defined the music and culture of the decade. We have to talk about vinyl. During the 2010s, pop-punk, emo, and punk rock bands pressed everything they could on vinyl. If I could find a graph of subgenre vinyl sales from 2010 to 2019, I can prove to you that those fans and those genres of music single-handedly saved vinyl, and it's the reason why Taylor Swift and Beyonce and all these mainstream artists are now pressing vinyl again, because it's profitable. They're not going into this and pressing vinyl because they think it's going to lose money. They think it's going to make them money. And the punk rock, pop punk, and emo scene never gets the credit for saving vinyl. Again, I couldn't find any subgenre data, but here you can clearly see that rock music is really the only reason that vinyl is having its current resurgence. If you want to learn more about the 2010s emo and pop punk revival, I did an entire video about that, and I'll have it linked in the description. The 2010s brought a lot of change to pop punk. It was the final years of the Warped Tour, you had the rise of streaming music, and no more mainstream outlet for pop punk. But that was all about to change. Now let's talk about what's happening in the pop punk scene today. In the early 2020s, we had what I call a mini revival of pop punk in the mainstream, with artists like Machine Gun Kelly, Willow, Demi Lovato, Olivia Rodrigo, even Avril Lavigne made a pop punk album again. You also had legendary punk rock labels like Epitaph putting on emo rap mixed with pop punk, something like Little Lotus, and you also had influencers using the pop punk and emo sound, and definitely the pop punk and emo aesthetic, artists like Jaden and Huddy. And look, if you want me to make fun of all of these mainstream artists using pop punk and emo to just make money, I'm not going to do that. Some of the songs were good and catchy. I completely understand why pop punk and emo got popular again during this, 3-4 year span, I would say. And if you're sitting there going, Michael, nobody thinks Machine Gun Kelly's pop punk albums sounded nostalgic like Blink-182 in the early 2000s. Well, here are the comments from some Machine Gun Kelly music videos. These people sure seem to think that Machine Gun Kelly sounds like emo and pop punk from the 2000s. This era of pop punk also led straight into the TikTokification, the influencerification of emo and pop punk on TikTok, for example. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into all of that, and some of the influencers that are associated with emo on TikTok and stuff like that, which I'm not going to get into in this video. But if we're just looking at the data, a lot of the TikTokers making pop punk or emo, a lot of their songs have millions of streams. I honestly think a lot of people are still figuring out music and going viral, and your 15 seconds of your 3-minute song going viral on TikTok, and that being the only thing that people want to hear at shows. Sometimes we have bands in the scene that don't want to play their most popular song because maybe they wrote it when they were in high school and now they're 40 and they're not playing this song, but everybody just yells it out at shows. But now people just want to hear that 15-second clip that went viral on TikTok. They don't even want to hear the whole song anymore. So I think a lot of that is changing, especially who knows what's going to happen with TikTok, especially if it goes away. Because if TikTok goes away, then I don't even know how to say it. I mean, it's going to be the largest empty space of attention and consumers, and all of those people have to go somewhere. None of these people who spend hours doom scrolling on TikTok, I do it too, none of us are beholden to TikTok and are never going to use another app that uses short form video if TikTok goes away. All those eyes and all those views and all that attention is going to go somewhere else. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how music and major labels and up-and-coming bands, how everybody kind of figures out what to do if something like TikTok goes away. While this mini revival didn't really help the up-and-coming bands rise to that next level of mainstream popularity, it did create a massive swell of nostalgia for the early 2000s bands. Blink-182, Yellowcard, My Chemical Romance all came back or reunited and released new music. Here's a crazy stat. Billboard reported that My Chemical Romance's UK European tour from a few years ago was the band's most profitable tour ever. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. Instead of Warped Tour, we now have the When We Were Young Fest, which literally only exists because of nostalgia. Nostalgia, it's a hell of a drug. I think the pop punk scene is in a great place right now with bands like Hot Mulligan, Origami Angel, 408, Taylor Acorn, Meet Me at the Altar, Winona Fighter, Good Hangs, Youth Fountain. Bands from the 2010s are still making great music like The Wonder Years and The Story So Far, and legacy bands like Blink-182, Paramore, Sum 41, all of them recently released new albums. If you like pop punk, you have a lot of new music and new bands to choose from. Starting with the Ramones to the mainstream popularity in the 2000s, through streaming music, through social media, pop punk is still here. And the current scene is doing a great job of mixing nostalgia with new sounds and new bands. And that's the history of pop punk. Please like the video, it really helps me out. Please share the video, please subscribe if you haven't, tell all your friends, and thanks for watching.